Welcome to my talk. My name is Will Smith, and today I'm going to talk about real-time lighting in Notch. So, who here has used Notch to build realistic scenes before, or realistic assets? Excellent, that's good. How many 3D artists are there here today? Excellent. Any advanced 3D artists? Sort of UV mapping? Excellent. All right, so the presentation I'm going to talk about today is real-time, keeping it real-time, achieving high-quality lighting in a real-time environment. I'll be presenting the talk. Later on in the talk, Matt Swoboda will be joining me on the presentation to talk about the more technical side of the lighting within Notch and how all the nodes work and things like that. So a little bit about me. My career began in the games industry in the early 2000s in a small company called Blue 52. I started out as an artist working in all areas of sort of 3D modelling, from props to characters to environments. And this is where I first met Matt. We worked on our first real-time engine for the PS2 game Stolen. Matt wrote the code for the engine. Myself and the other artists helped develop the engine using various demos and stuff that we produced to really push the tech. The company folded after the game came out. We were both made redundant, although Matt left before that happened. We only did the art and the code. We didn't do the design. Matt went to Sony. I started freelancing as an artist, and that's when I started working on the Unreal Engine. I've spent 15 years working in the games industry, building games in the Unreal Engine, leading the art team in the art development on the Batman Arkham series of games. Got one cheer. When the Unreal 4 engine came out, I decided to leave games and start producing visuals for architecture, photorealistic visualizations for a range of companies who needed to see products and things like that that weren't actually built, or buildings that weren't created. Over the past few years, I've been working on and off with Matt on various projects when an opportunity to join Notch came about, and I started working with Notch in 2018 in the summer. 2018, last year. So, in this talk, I'll be addressing these subjects. What is real-time? Offline rendering versus real-time rendering. What's the catch? Adopting real-time techniques. Quality versus speed. Keeping a flexible and creative workflow. The golden nugget of optimization. Lighting tools in Notch, which Matt will be covering, and I'm finally going to go through some of the content that we've done in Notch in real time. So, what is real time? So we know what offline rendering is. It's something that's been around for years. It's really good at producing realistic results. But once you've completed something in offline rendering, to change that scene can take minutes, hours, if not days, to re-render parts of it, to look at something from a different angle. And to do something on the fly to that scene just isn't possible. So this is where real-time engines come in. They're paving the way forward, producing as good results as offline rendering, but giving you far more creative workflow or freedom. With faster iteration speeds, more flexibility, and more immersive experiences such as interactivity, VR and AR. It's a far better pipeline. So, in this scene is an example of a V-Ray offline rendered scene versus a real-time Notch scene. As you can see, both the scenes are extremely realistic. But what are the differences between the scenes? The V-Ray scene is a 2D render. The setup, depending on the setup, It could take between 30 seconds to a few hours to create this image. If you want to see this F1 car from a different angle, you need to render out some more images, or you could render out a movie to show the whole car, but this takes a lot of time. The notch scene, however, is in real time. We can rotate the scene, we can show the car from any angle, we can change the colour of the car on the fly, we can remove or change the car altogether because it's real time. There's no waiting, and it can be done instantly. So at the top of the image is the same F1 car as here, but this is on a running real time on an AR LED wall at white light, just to show that it's a real-time thing that we've developed. So what's the catch with real-time? If it's so good, why aren't we all using it? Apart from most of us here are. Well, it's one of, there's a big group of people, one of the biggest industries in the world, the computer games industry, that are mainly using real-time. And if you're not using it, well, you should be. And there's no catch. So creating assets for real-time is not really different from creating assets for any other industry. If you have time to make assets, you may as well make real-time that you can update in real-time engines. But it's all about learning how to create them. It's learning new software and adhering to some basic modeling techniques that have mostly been developed in the games industry. So, adopting real-time techniques. I'm going to be covering why these techniques were developed, what these techniques are. I'm going to be looking at low poly meshes, taking a look at UVs, and I'm going to look at smoothing groups and material IDs, as well as high poly baking. Sorry about that noise. So why were these techniques developed? Over the years, computer games have become ever more realistic. The more realistic they've become, the easier it is to spot when errors in the rendering. Anyone can see changing colour when static meshes are swapped with animated meshes, or when characters glow because they're lit differently from the environment they're actually in. If you try and replicate the real world, it's harder to hide these rendering errors because everyone understands what the real world should or is supposed to look like. For example, if you have a character walking down the street, you expect that character to cast a shadow. You'd expect shadows to be cast on the character. If animated objects moves in a scene, you expect the colour and the shadowing to stay the same. You don't expect a colour pop or the image to change. You'd expect wet surface to reflect the world around them. You'd expect reflections on windows. And the only way to really make this happen correctly is to make the objects in the scene dynamic, or as we say, real-time. So dynamic lighting, real-time shadows on characters, the same lighting on static props as the dynamic props. But there is a cost, and making everything dynamic costs performance. Running real-time engines is expensive on the graphics hardware. So to compensate for this, there have been decades of development in the tools and techniques enabling 3D artists to create great-looking content that looks realistic, but also costs little in performance. So what are these techniques? Does anyone know? One person? Excellent. So I'm going to tell you them. So just a note, most of these techniques have to be done outside of Notch in your preferred 3D package. I use 3D Studio Max. know you guys may use C4D or Maya or other packages. So in this image, there are two meshes. There's a high poly camera mesh on the left. This is 355,000 polys, and it's the typical sort of mesh you would use in offline rendering to get a decent render. And you'd usually produce a 2D image or a video, and you'd render this using something like V-Ray. On the right-hand side is the optimized version of the mesh. That's 16,000 polys. And this is the mesh that we're going to use for the notch scene. And I'll show you how to optimize that later. So the difference in poly counts is really important. Say you took a room and you made it out of the optimized meshes. Say you had a couple of dozen meshes in your scene. It would run fine. There's probably only a couple of 100,000 polys in the scene, and it would work perfectly. If you create a real-time scene filled with messages that are a couple of 100,000 polys each, the scene will quickly turn into several million polys, and the performance will be extremely poor. Sorry. So now we're going to look at UVs. So once you've got your mesh, we're going to then UV the mesh. There are several things to note when creating UVs. For an object like this, it's always important to create a unique UV set. So what does this mean? So a unique UV set means that every part of the mesh has its own unique part of the texture you're producing for it. So none of the UVs overlap, and this means that we can texture every part of the object or every face of every polygon individually, and there'll be no issues regarding overlapping ambient occlusion maps or shadowing and things like that. So then once we've built the low poly mesh, we've UV'd it, we want to add smoothing groups and material IDs. So when we add smoothing groups to a mesh, a good tip is to use different smoothing groups between naturally occurring surfaces and faces on the actual object. So on this object, the plastic body of the camera is using one UV set, one smoothing group, sorry, and the buttons, the lenses, other objects are using others, and this will really help reinforce the shape of the camera, the natural splits and the edges where you want edges. Now we'll move on to material IDs. It's always a good idea that when you have an object like this, to split the materials up into separate IDs. So in this camera, I've split off the plastic housing, I've split off the rubber on the grip and on the lens, and the actual glass of the lenses itself. And the reason I've done this is because it gives you much more control over the individual materials in Notch. So when you bring them in, you can add opacity to the lens, and you can have completely different reflections on the lens to the metals. You can add more metallic to the buttons, and for things like the rubbers, you can lower the roughness or dial down the roughness on that, or well, dial up the roughness on that, sorry. So now we move on to high poly baking. So high poly baking, this is a technique where the details from the high poly model are transferred to the low poly model. And to do this, we need a high poly mesh, a low poly model, and a unique set of UVs on the low poly model. I'll use 3D Studio Max to do this, and I'll use a projection modifier, which I've applied to this model for this technique, and I'll use that to bake the normal map. The high poly details of the high poly mesh are projected onto the low poly mesh in the form of a normal texture. The normal texture created takes the difference between the details of the high poly and low poly mesh to render a normal map texture. And then the normal map texture is actually rendered in the shape of the UV layout from the low poly mesh. So then once you've got your normal map and you've applied it to your low poly model, it will fake the extra details of the high poly mesh on the low poly model. And you shouldn't really be able to tell the difference between the high poly mesh and the low poly mesh once you've done this when they're side to side. Obviously, this means you've made something look identical to the high poly mesh, but it's far cheaper. And it's a good little technique to do on things like this. The same technique is used on to create the ambient occlusion texture. The high poly details of the camera buttons, the edges, the seams, the grip, they're all baked in the ambient occlusion texture. And when the low poly model has both these normal maps, the normal texture and the V-Ray ambient occlusion texture applied to them, it really does look like the high poly model. So, quality versus speed. I'm going to be looking at the pros and cons of buying assets, being prepared to do a little optimization for real time. I'm going to show you the poly optimization techniques, the nemesis of real time, or tips that I've learned over the years, keeping a flexible and creative workflow, and the golden nugget of optimization. So, buying assets online is fantastic. There are great resources out there, and buying an asset rather than creating an asset will save you days and days of work, if not weeks. But be prepared to do some optimization if you want to take it into a real-time engine. There are loads of sites out there to buy assets from, even sites specifically tailored for real-time assets. The assets are really good quality, really high quality, but I've rarely bought an asset that hasn't needed some kind of optimization or rework, even assets specifically made for the real-time workflow. High poly assets have a lot of wasted polys just in the nature of how they're made and how they're extruded. It's not bad modeling, it's just how they're created. But the main shapes of these assets are always brilliant to use, and I'd always say buy something because it will save you loads of time compared to creating it from scratch. Not many of the assets that you buy have smoothing groups, so make sure you always apply smoothing groups to an asset that you buy. And finally, always create a unique UV set for any assets that you buy. Although any textured assets that you buy generally tend to have UV layouts already assigned to them. Otherwise, you can't really texture them. So I'm now going to show you some quick or simple mesh optimization techniques. So many assets that you buy tend to have a lot of extra additional edges on flat surfaces. If you look at the far image, if you remove those edges, take them out of your model, the model won't change at all, but you've saved yourself a load of polygons. If you remove back-facing polygons from objects that you're only going to see from one side, you're going to save yourself loads of polygons, and the asset will be cheaper, but again, the shape of the object won't change, so it'll still look identical to the object you started with, but be far cheaper. If your object is sat on the ground, remove the bottom faces. The object's still going to look identical, but you've saved polys. Anything under edges, if there's ledges, anywhere you can't see, delete the polygons, if you don't see them, and you've saved yourself, you could have 1/10 of the polygon count of the original asset, which will obviously run far better when you bring it into your into Notch. So edges on corners, they don't really need that many edges. Tend to stick to around 3 for a nice smooth corner. Round objects can very quickly build up polys. A round object only needs as many edges as you can see actually in Notch. So a small trick to do is just to move the object in and out of Notch when you're viewing it. If you can see edges, then add some more faces until you can't see any square edges on your round object. So it's all about using your eye to see how round the object actually is in your scene. Don't just go blasting loads of edges on a round object just because you think that's going to make it look any rounder, because on screen it won't look any different if you reduce it down. So another tip is, if you have an object like this tube, on the inner edges, reduce the edges down. When you build up objects, the main thing to think about is the silhouette of the actual object. Things like the inner radius, you're never really going to see that from any angles to note that it's not round on the inside, depending on how big the object is in the scene. And lastly, if you have an object that's absolutely covered in small detail, this is a wooden trolley, and there are bolts holding this bracket in. It's on the underneath of this this mesh. You will never see these bolts on screen. Delete them. You'll save loads of polygons. So the nemesis of real time. So here's some examples of assets that quickly become high poly. Nuts, bolts, small details that you hardly see will always add a lot of polygons, especially if they're round. So rather than build these bolts and things like that in a 3D model, I would always put things like this into a texture and bake a normal map with the bolts in it. For instance, this object, the whole object, I think, was about 60,000 polys. The bolts themselves were 40,000 polys. So if you delete those, you're still going to have your object looking pretty much identical, but with only 20,000 polys. It was quite a big object in the scene, but even so, deleting those bolts didn't make a difference to the visuals of the actual object. Then we move on to things like pipes. Pipes are always pretty bad for modelling because depending on the number of edges on the actual circumference of the pipe, once you start dividing that up along the actual length of the pipe, every time you divide it up, you double the poly count of your asset, or you add the same amount of polys again. So the best thing to do with things like pipes is just reduce down the amount of edges on the circumference as much as you can before people can actually see that it's looking blocky. When I actually made this object, I ended up making the wire for this. This is actually a wire for a bulb on the end. This wire I just turned into a triangle. You couldn't see it. It still had the same effect. And once it's got a normal map on, you can't even tell. And if it's got one smoothing group on, that reinforces that. So things like wires, anything round, polygon counts go out the window very quickly. And lastly, wheels. So this wheel, it's got the tread on it, it's got lots of bolts on it. The actual circumference of the tyre has probably got the right amount of edges on it, but things like the tyre tread, I would remove. It's far too high poly. You're not going to see it. Most of it's going to be in shadow, unless the brief is you actually have a close-up of this actual tyre. I would actually put that in a normal map. I wouldn't model it. The rim of this wheel is far, far too high poly. It should be reduced down substantially, and you've also got a lot of edges on the actual flat surfaces. Delete all that, you're going to save thousands of polys. The best thing about making a vehicle and optimizing a wheel is you copy it 4 times, so you've made 4 times the amount of optimizations in one go. Right. So the next thing is keeping a flexible and creative workflow. And what do I mean by that? So whenever you build an asset, use the same workflow for every asset. Find great reference, that's always key. Buy or create an asset, optimized for real time. Add smoothing groups, produce the textures and materials, bake in the normal maps if needed, and then export it in an FBX, PNG, etc., and repeat, and just do the same technique each time. So, the golden nugget of optimization. What is it? Can you see it? So what I mean by this is actually an 8K texture of a gold nugget, which is completely pointless for this on this 1K screen. And it's the same with your assets. This should be probably 128 by 128 pixels or something, but it's the same with your assets. See how big your asset actually is on screen. Does it need that many polygons? Did the textures need to be that big? If not, reduce them down. So you need to think about your scene and how you're building it. Don't just throw loads of polygons into something because it will look nice, because it won't change at all if you reduce it down. And you probably won't even notice, and your scene will run better. And don't be precious about optimizing a model. I used to be very precious about my work, and when someone said a game wasn't running, please cut out the polygons in your model, I didn't like doing it. But then if you realize that your scene is going to only run at 10 FPS, then what's worse? A scene that's running slowly, or an optimized model that looks slightly less detailed, but the scene runs perfectly. Now we're going to look at lighting tools in Notch. And for this, Matt is going to go through it. If that's okay? You don't have a mic? Okay, he's going to grab a mic.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
What do you recommend, to triangulate the model or to have the model in quad?
What do I recommend? What, sorry?
Triangulate or quadding the model?
Quadding, definitely. Triangulating, if you've got a triangulated model, it is so hard to optimize. If you've got a model made out of quads, it's much simpler because you can select edges that go around the object. I'd never triangulate stuff. I've had meshes where I've been asked to reduce down the polys, and it's been a triangular mesh or triangulated mesh, and it's been absolutely impossible. So, yeah, so whenever I optimize, I always, there's this thing in Max you can use which will quadulate your mesh, and I'll always do that. It's much simpler.
Don't triangulate on import if you can help it. So with the FBX loader in Notch, if you turn off triangulation and you know your mesh is good, like it's only quads and triangles, it will load a lot faster. So don't triangulate on import.
No.
So I'm covering for Ed, who's unfortunately ill and couldn't make it today, and by talking about lighting tools in Notch, so some of the nodes that we've got in Notch. So there's a bunch of lighting nodes beyond the regular light nodes that are used to achieve good quality lighting for different purposes. So we've got the skylight node, which is basically like a dome light. Can take an HDR map to give you lighting from like all directions. And then we've got a couple of techniques for doing reflections. We've got screen space reflections and voxel cone tracing. Screen space reflections is basically a 2D cheat. So it can only reflect stuff that you can actually see in your render. It can only reflect pixels that you see in your render. And then you've got voxel cone tracing, which turns your scene into like a low-res Minecraft-style cube setup, and then uses that to trace reflections. And that works really well for like soft, blurry reflections and really bad for sharp ones. This is all like pre-ray tracing, so we don't have any good solutions that are perfect. And then additionally, we have environment maps, which are just reflecting an image. And then we've got light probes, which went in 0.9.21, which are basically like having lots and lots of environment maps in your scene in a kind of grid, and generating them from what they can see. And then we've got the regular light nodes. So here's what some of the nodes roughly do. So you can see the skylight node. So this image is entirely lit with a skylight node and an HDR map that has a bright sun in it. So you can actually do a lot of lighting with this, and it looks very soft and diffuse. And the voxel cone lighting node, you can see it's doing blurry reflections of the objects in the ground and so on. But when you combine the skylight and the voxel cone lighting node, you can actually get quite a realistic, like a one bounce solution. And a lot of the renders you see, the realistic renders you see at the end of this talk, they're all doing the same. They're all doing the same thing of using skylight and voxel cone for most of their lighting. And there's a more detailed example in a minute. So quickly go on to light probes. Light probes is a video game technique that's been around for about 10 years at least. And the idea is, as I said, you take your scene and you put a load of points in the scene that are probe positions, often in a grid. And at each position of those, you render a spherical view outwards of your scene, outwards from that probe. So it gives you a little environment map at each location. And then if you want to use that on a model, the model just looks at the closest probe at any point in space and samples from it like a reflection. So it's a way of like generating better than environment map kind of still cheating reflections. And if you really, really blur the environment map a lot and downsample it a lot, you get basically a diffuse bounce reflection. And this is video games have been doing this since like PlayStation 3, early PlayStation 3. So it's really, really well established. And you can now do it in Notch. And there's a load of resources about how to do this online. So if you, in video games in general. So if you look on the left, you've got how it looks without probe lighting and how it looks with probes being used as a diffuse bounce. And you can see like the dragons picking up the bounce from the wall and so on. And this is a really cheap technique, particularly if your scene's static. So the probes only need to be generated once, and then they can be sampled lots of times. So it's super cheap. And you can see on the last image, the balls are the probes, basically where the probes are in the scene and what they look like. So they basically look very blurry and diffuse. And so here's with probes off, and here's with probes on. So you can see all those second bounces all done with the probes. And here's a look at how the node graph looks. There's one special thing about this, which is, so you see the probe lighting node at the bottom. That has a bunch of nulls attached to it, and the nulls position where the probes are. So if you stick one of those in the scene and then you attach some nulls, it will start generating the probes and using them for lighting. This is definitely worth trying. There's one special thing about this, which is the introduction of a point cache node, which we'll explain in a second. So we're going to use this example of a vehicle and how this is set up in with various lighting things in Notch. So we load the model in, and then we use if we just stick a skylight node directly on it, it gives you this kind of omnidirectional, like ambient occlusion look. It's just lighting evenly from all sides with a white light. It's a pure white sky dome. But if you load in an HDR environment map that you downloaded off the internet, and then you stick that on the skylight, then you can actually get something that looks like quite a realistic outdoor scene. So that's only 2 nodes to set up, the skylight node and the environment map going into it. And that straight away gives you this kind of like decent hemisphere omnidirectional light. Now, I was talking about this point cache, the magic point cache. So this is the point cache. So when we're doing things like rendering skylights or generating probes, what you end up doing is rendering the scene from loads and loads of angles. And if your scene's high poly, that can be super slow. So we came up with a solution for that. We basically take your scene and generate points evenly spread over the entire scene. You can see those on the car. And then we use the points to do all the rendering of the different views, which is super fast. So it's much faster than rendering the scene lots and lots of times. We just render the points from lots of different angles. So we can get like a 10 times speed up or something by doing this. So a lot of these nodes, like the skylight and so on, take a point cache as input. So you drop a point cache into the scene. If we look at the node graph here, you can see the point cache node at the bottom left. And that goes straight into the probe lighting node. So if nothing's hooked, it will render the scene. If a point cache is hooked, it will render the cache. And here's how that looks. So once we start introducing materials, so they've got a normal map in there now. This actually looks like quite a decent render, even though it's just a skylight. And here's the node graph for this. So this is the entire node graph for the lighting setup of the scene. So we have an environment map that feeds the skybox, so you can actually see it on the scene. And then you've got the skylight, which is using the environment map and the point cache. There's one other node here, the screen space reflections node, which we'll get onto in a minute. So then they've continued to set up materials for the car. And now we look at the effect of adding screen space reflections, which is anyone's tried this. It's good for getting a localized, quite cheap reflection in Notch. So if you add this is without screen space reflection. If we add it in, you can see the difference this has. So you can see a lot of the details, and like the spoiler is now reflected in itself. The metal starts to reflect. So this does like small fine-grained reflections quite well. And it also will sample the environment map. So where nothing gets hit, it will go through to the environment map. Another view of that without the SSR node and with it. So it has quite a major impact for metallic surfaces. And finally, no image is complete without a ton of post effects. So you can see this is just having a final scene and then doing a bunch of color grading, film grading, a color LUT, and depth of field. And you can see what a huge difference that makes on the final render. So color grading and fixing in post is absolutely important. I'm going to hand you back to Will now.
Excellent. I don't need the mic. Thank you. Excellent. So now we're going to look at a few scenes that we put together in Notch. All of these scenes, they're 2D renders, but they do run real-time in Notch. The first one is a visualization of a room. This scene has actually been used at White Light for an AR project, projecting on their big LED screens. And it was built to scale, so you could go into this room in AR, and we didn't have any interaction in there, but if we had put it in, you could interact with the actual scene. This is another scene that I built. This is an alien world scene. This was using an off-the-shelf kitbash scene. The kitbash scene was fantastic. It did require a little bit of optimization to get it working, but this runs pretty quick. This was also used for an ArtStation magazine article that we did that you can all read if you get the ArtStation magazine. As you've seen, we're producing a lot of, you can produce vehicles pretty well now that look pretty realistic. So we've been building a lot of those. And we've just been building lots of photorealistic sort of objects. And this is before we've even tested out the ray tracing. So hopefully it'll get even better. So I think that is pretty much it now. So any questions at all?
We have time for one question, so make it good.
Okay, one question.
Oh, he took his hand down. Hey, okay, okay, it's back up. Good.
Yeah, it was maybe more for Matt. I was curious, you had you're using screen space reflections with an environment map.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't the environment map do the reflection by itself? I feel like that would normally be what it's used for. What does the screen space reflection add to it, I guess?
The screen space reflection, so what it actually does is imagine you've got your full render with a depth buffer. And so for each point on the screen, we do a little ray trace, but only looking at the depth buffer in like 2.5D. So you can only see the stuff that's been rendered. So you can't like see the bottom of the car because it's not in the depth. And so it does that, and any ray that doesn't hit anything, it goes to the environment map. So it gives you like a bit better than the environment map.
Okay, that's what I was wondering, 'cause it seemed like it made a world of difference to the metal
Yeah,
in that case. But that's what it is.
It's mostly the environment map, but it's occluding it with stuff it can see in the car.
Okay, I think that's it. I think I'm going to get kicked off. If you do have any questions, just come and see me, email me after the talk.
All right, everyone give Will a big hand. Didn't he do good?
Thank you.
He did well.